Hello and welcome to the Church in Action podcast. Today we're picking up with part 2 of Charles Galba's conversation with Gordon MacDonald, pastor, coach, speaker, and author of more than 12 books, including Going Deep. He successfully led almost every kind of ministry and is one of the church's greatest thinkers, all while serving as a notable practitioner. Today, Gordon shares what he describes as one of the most significant things he did in ministry to intentionally build transformed, whole-life disciples. You can listen to part 1 of today's conversation wherever fine podcasts are found or at our website, visionnewengland.org.
First thing I'd say is, and this was, again, we're talking about some things that a lot of us wish we were taught better. But the first decision a pastor has to make in a church is, can I get my elders, or whatever the term is for the leading board, to buy into the notion that building and training people is the number one priority of the church. In most churches, what we do with discipleship is we turn it into a program. And if we're big enough, we hire somebody at the second or third level to run that program. And then we wonder why people are less than motivated. The woman or man who really wants to get something done is a person who looks across the organization and says, where is the most important action going on? And who's leading it? And how can I be a part of it? But if you make discipleship something that's in the hands of a second or third level person, lay staff or paid staff, you send a message to the congregation. This is optional. So what a pastor needs to do, and it took me a long period of time before I did it in my own church. What a pastor has to do is he needs to go to his board and say, what would it take for me to convince you that even though it may not be the largest activity in our church, it's the most important, and that is discipling people. I want you to give me 20% of my time to spend with a small group of people. And if you let me do this, every year I will give you 15 new spiritual leaders. Up to 5 years, that's 75 people. Let a few drop out for attrition, maybe you get down to 60. But can you imagine 60 women and men who knew how to keep their souls fresh before God, who knew how to activate the spiritual gifts that the Holy Spirit has given them, who knew how to cast influence in the right ways? 60 people. It would be an amazing church that had that many people. With that clarity of vision. So where I'm going with this, I don't want to beat it to death. Where I'm going with this is a pastor has to convince his or her elders or deacons that training is the most important thing a church does. If you'd asked Jesus that question, I think he would have given you that answer.
Well, talk about. I want to come to the process that you put in place, or how you did it once you started, what you wrote about in Going Deep. But I want to talk about how Jesus did it. Can you talk about this rabbinic covenant that you've shared before, and what that was and how that worked?
Yeah, I love to talk about this. First of all, because I don't hear too many talk, so I feel like I got a little piece of territory that maybe is all my own. I can make the rules. I'm being silly when I say that. You understand?
Yeah, I've shared it with other people, and I make it sound like I'm the genius in the room.
I think one of the things that we have not been taught well enough is how the Bible describes the rabbinical relationship that a discipler has with a disciple. Now, rabbis began to emerge in the Hebrew culture in the 2 or 3 centuries before Jesus came to earth to be with us. Before that, there were discipleship engagements. My most precious one is the relationship between Eli and Samuel, way back deep in the Older Testament. And, Eli has been this lousy father. And isn't it kind that God gives him one more chance to do it right? And what he didn't do with his own sons, he does with Samuel. And what's the number one thing he does with Samuel? He teaches him how to hear the voice of God. And we all know that wonderful Sunday school story of Samuel rushing to Eli's bedside 2 or 3 different times. Did you call? No, I didn't call. Go back to bed a second, a third time. And then Eli begins to catch on as to what's doing here. And he says to Samuel, The next time you hear that noise, tell me what it says, because he's curious too. And out of that comes this instruction. And when you hear the noise, say, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." What's Eli doing? He's teaching Samuel how to hear the directional voice of God. And you have that all the way through the Older Testament. Then you get to the time of the rabbis. And these are itinerant people who work throughout the land of Israel. They are judges. They're sitting, adjudicating the disputes of people. They are teachers. And they are trainers of people. When they move into a village, one of the things they're looking for all the time is, where is that young man, particularly a young man, who I can teach and who will take my teachings and perpetuate them long after I've left this village. Another way to put it is that rabbis are like universities are today. They didn't have formal schools in those days. They had rabbis. And if you were the son of a wealthy family, you could apply to one of the outstanding rabbis in the Temple of Jerusalem and ask to be included in his group. And your father would probably pay some of the bills, but that was schooling in those days. And it was understood, I don't want to be in a role here, but it was understood that if I become a disciple of you, Charles, and you're the rabbi for the moment, and I'm your disciples, one, I will learn every day by imitating you. You're my library. I don't have any books. You're the book.
Mm-hmm.
So I watch everything you do. I watch the way you put your arm around your wife. I watch the way you help dust the furniture. I watch the way you teach the person who's angry. I just watch you, and I try to imitate everything I see in your life because you're the book. Then the second thing I do is I memorize your message. Every rabbi has a stump speech. So I memorize that and I practice giving it. Now the rabbi has someone who will perpetuate his teaching. There's a lot of people who think that the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew is Jesus' stump speech, that wherever he went, he unfolded the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount and explained it in one way or the other. That could or may not be true, but it's a good guess. Then the third thing Jesus did, or they did, was they served the master. They found a place for him to sleep at night. They found food for him to eat. They row him across the lake. You can see the 12 disciples doing all of this for Jesus over and over and over again. Then fourthly, he sends them out to speak and preach and teach in villages. And when they come back, they kind of have a quiz. How did you do? How were you treated? What did you learn? What questions came? So it's all on-the-job training. And then finally, and people don't talk enough about this, there comes a release point where the rabbi says to various of his disciples, it's time for you to go. I want you to go out into the world. I want you to make disciples like I made you. And so I send you out with my authority. That's what I call a 100-year strategy. Jesus never expected for his methods to change the world in 2 years, more like 100 years. And if you think about it, it's 100 years between when Jesus teaches the first 12 and they get it and start out. When you really see the fruits of Christianity spreading across the globe, it took about 4 generations. And that's what Jesus was doing. He didn't worry about crowds. He worried about the 12 who would learn from him. Whew, I'm exhausted.
That's okay. And I remember you and I sharing one time that, and we put up a thing in Fellowship Hall and say, whoever wants to come for 6 weeks, come.
Yeah.
Right.
And they come for all the wrong reasons.
Right. That's right. And so you I know you built something when you were still in pastoral ministry based on that model. And so what did you end up, how did you go through the process of making disciples?
Well, as you and I have talked more than once, the vision of the whole notion of discipleship training came to me when I spent a weekend speaking at West Point to the cadets. On Saturday night, I sat with about 150 cadets for 2 hours, and they asked me questions. To this day, I have never been asked the depth of questions that those cadets asked me that night. I went home absolutely drunk with joy that I'd had a serious conversation with a younger group of men and women who were cadets at West Point. The follow-up question then, which comes, is where is my church training cadets? Where do we identify that small select group of people who really want to seriously learn and grow what it means to walk and serve with Jesus Christ? And my answer to myself was, there isn't any place. We do a little leadership training, as you said, for 6 Wednesday nights or Thursday nights. And yeah, a lot of the people who come are not ready for it. And the people you wish would come, they don't have the time. So I went back to the church and I sat with my staff and I told them about my weekend experience. And I said, we've got to have a version of West Point. And everybody smiled very politely. Everybody thought it was a great idea. But nobody wanted to do it. And if you think that's bad, I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. I was hoping I could delegate it. I didn't think of this as, bring West Point into your life, into your style and fabric of ministry, and discard some other things. I just wanted to hand the option off to somebody else. And one of our staff members did work at it for a while. But it became clearer and clearer to me when he left that position that somebody else at a higher level had to do that. And Gail said to me one day, my wife Gail, it seems to me that the idea that you're nursing along is so significant and so novel that the only person in the church who can start it and make it happen is the number one person on the hierarchy ladder, and that's you. And then she added, and I love her for this, she said, and if you ever want to do that, I will come alongside and be your partner. I will not be your secretary. I will not take notes. I will not serve coffee. That's for somebody else. I want to be your partner, and I want 50% of the action. Now, that's some wife.
Yeah.
And so that became one of the first principles that we began to fool with. It would be a team-taught situation, hopefully with a man and a woman, hopefully a married couple if that was possible. And I would not have more than 50% of the action. Best decision I ever made. Gail was phenomenal at that process. And over the years, I learned that people loved Gail. They only liked me. But there was something about it. She brought the spirit of mother into the room. And the young men just loved listening to her talk. And the girls they were thrilled to have a member of their gender that they could ask questions to. So those were a couple of things we learned right away. The third thing we learned is this has to be selection and not volunteerism. And so we agreed, the two of us, let's take 3 or 4 months and let's just watch the congregation and let's pick out men and women and some couples that might be interested in this, and let's challenge their heads off. So for 3 months, 4 months, if Gail were sitting right here next to me, she would stop me at this point and she would say, honey, tell Charles that for those 3 months, one of the most important things we did was pray. We kept begging God to turn out and make visible to us the kind of people he wanted to go through this training process. And she's right. She's absolutely right. So after 3 or 4 months,
3 months is a big commitment, right? We want some of us. I'm one of them. I'm happy to pray at the beginning of this meeting. Now let's get it done. But you guys prayed for 3 solid months.
Oh yeah, I'm probably exaggerating a little bit when I say that almost every Sunday afternoon, as we were driving home from church, our conversation went like this. I was talking to Joe and Mary this morning. They have a unique love for each other. You can tell they cry for every piece of information and discipling they can get their hands on. I think we should put them on our list. And I would say, I talked to Bob today. He really, when he's in charge of something, everything works. We really need to get into his life and see if we could give him more attention. And that's the way conversations went. And Gail would keep this list of names on a piece of paper. And once we'd scratch somebody's name off, we'd add another name. And then came the night, usually in the month of April, when we would invite 20 people. 20 people was all we're going to do. for an evening at our home, and we would feed them an incredibly good meal so they were in a good mood. And then Gail and I would get up and we would dialogue and we would say, we have a reason for inviting you here this afternoon. We want you to know that we've been watching you for the last 3 months, and we see these kind of capabilities in you. Mary, we have seen you in this way. Bob, we've seen you like this. And we think if you would give yourself to discipleship for a year and come and allow us to pour our lives into you, God could really use you in the coming years, whether it's in the church or beyond the church. We don't care. We just want you to be able to hear the call of God at the end of the process. And we intuited that if we challenged 20 people and we would say to them, and when you consider this invitation, you will be with us every Monday night for 3 hours. You don't go to the Celtics game when someone gives you a ticket. You don't find ways to take a night off. We want 40 Monday nights from you. So go home and spend 2 weeks thinking, praying, and come back and tell us what your answer was. And we assumed correctly, that of the 20, about 14 or 13 people would say yes. And every year, that's what we got, 12, 13, 14. And when you raise the bar that high, Charles, which is something we don't do in most churches, when you raise the bar that high, people generally meet the standards. They want to be challenged. They want someone to really believe that they've got great potential as the years go by. But churches rarely exploit that potential. They make it too easy, and they beg people, wouldn't you give this money? Wouldn't you go to this program? Wouldn't you do this? When good people really want you to challenge their socks off. So for 6 years, every year we started a new group, had the same number, had the same standards. Best 6 years of our lives in pastoral ministry.
And what did you do? Can you give us some examples of the kinds of things you would do with this group? I remember they would eat, but what are some things you would do with them besides?
Well, in general, we divided the evening up into 3 hours, although it was probably more like 48 or 50 minutes. And even that, went with the flow. I wrote down some things here. 1 or 2 things will surprise folks. The first thing we did in the first 3 weeks was to teach people Myers-Briggs. Gail is a licensed instructor for Myers-Briggs. And so for 3 weeks, she taught the basic principles of Myers-Briggs temperament studies. And she worked on it and had everybody fill out what we call an indicator. And on the 4th Monday night, everybody learned what they were. And it was an incredible moment because people were delighted and surprised when somebody told them, this is your natural temperament, as this indicator shows it. And people were thrilled for someone to tell them about some capability they had. So the first hour of every night was Myers-Briggs. The second hour was reading. And every week, everybody had a chapter from a book or an article. And we would sit in a circle. And the first thing we would do was read this piece. It would take about 20 minutes. And as people would read one after the other, paragraph by paragraph, Gail and I would kind of interject something. We'd say, now, what was the author trying to say in that paragraph? What word leaps out and captures your attention? Where do you think the author was going when he or she said that? What we were doing is we were teaching people how to read with discernment. And furthermore, not just to read with discernment, but then to dialogue with the other members of the group. One of the things that gave Gail and me a real kick in the pants was if you had a married couple the first week they came, they would sit together. And if you watch this carefully, you'll see it over and over again. One of them will say something to the group and look to the other one, and with the question, was I all right? Do you agree with me? Or should I shut up? So what we learned to do is to separate husbands and wives. They had to sit across the room from each other so that one didn't have to feel like they needed the approval of the other to give their opinions. It changed the group. It was remarkable. when people had their freedom to give their opinions and not consult their spouse as to whether or not it represented their opinion too. So the second hour was dialogue. And it took about 12 weeks for the group to realize that they were a thinking machine and that everybody came to the circle with ideas which mixed with everybody else's would make a wonderful super idea that none of us could have produced by ourselves.
So you're trying to move us from I think our tendency is, well, I'm on a daily Bible reading plan. There's nothing wrong with that. Or I read whatever I read, but I read and whatever I get, but I'm not intentional about spending the time in to really figure out what the author is saying. Is that?
Well, I'm being a little bit mean when I say this. We don't teach Christians to think. We don't teach most Christians to read. We don't teach many Christians how to form an idea and polish it. It just doesn't happen. In every church, there'll be a few doctors and lawyers and people with professional training. They know how to do that, but there are not many of those people in most churches. The average person, if they do any reading, it's shallow literature, which does very, very little but just bolster up your own opinions. We wanted men and women to learn how to take the truth, handle it, build it, deepen it, discuss it with other people. And it's very interesting. It's very humbling to come to a circle and trade ideas because so many of us feel like we've got to be right. We can't afford to be wrong. But what's wrong with being wrong sometimes? And so for about 12 weeks, we would engender these conversations. We called it dialogue as opposed to discussion. Discussion is where you have an idea, I have an idea, and we compete with our ideas. A dialogue is where you have an idea, I have an idea. Let's see what would happen if we mix those ideas and created a bigger idea that neither one of us knew before we got there that night. Dialogue comes from the Holy Spirit. And the Spirit of God gets in a circle and he uses the mental capacities of people to help each other to grow and deal with things. And that's what happened in that second hour. The third hour, by the way, you may want to come back to that. The third hour was to talk about some skill in leadership and influence. And every week we were talking about some ability that people need if they're going to be influential people, wherever God calls them to be. So you started at 7, and we told people, another high bar, you don't get here at 7, you get here earlier than 7 so that we're all in our seats when the bell rings at 7. And we stayed till 10 o'clock. And after about a dozen weeks, a very interesting thing happens. People start coming earlier and earlier, and they start leaving later and later. And Gail and I would have to say, look, we're kind of old people. We're happy for you to be here at 10 o'clock, but if you want to talk anymore, you're going to have to do it under the street light out in the corner of the road. And sometimes we'd go to bed and we'd wake up at 11:30, and there'd be 4 or 5 of the people in the group still out under the light bulb talking about something that had happened that evening. But seeing people become tight with each other, not because they have to satisfy a program, but because they're loving one another. Mm-hmm. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. In the middle of the year for about 4 months, we call that storytelling type, where every person in the group writes his or her story. And this is not just a page and a half. This is 25 or 30 pages. We actually train some mentors to help people create their stories so that they were really frank and honest about the things they said, both to the good and to the bad side. Charles, we discovered something that for years of ministry we'd never realized. When you ask people to tell their stories from the depths of their souls, everybody has suffered. Everybody can tell you about something that happened in their lives that was terribly painful. Because of the way we often do church today, people never get to tell those stories. So we reduce discipling in most churches to just information peddling when we really want to do it by storytelling. And those months were incredibly sacred. And you could see people getting, every week, one person gave their story. And by the time you got 2/3 of the way around the circle over 2 or 3 months, these people were bonded together like you can't believe.
Yeah, you're reminding me. I chuckle because you're reminding me of the friend who, if you were still at his house at 10:15, he would start to sing "Blessed Be the Tie That Binds." But I do. You're right. I do want to go back to something you just said. When you said dialogue is from the Holy Spirit, what do you mean by that?
Well, the word dialogue means, its literal meaning is a word being pushed through something. The word discussion is a word that's the daughter word of concussion and percussion. When you talk about discussion, the implication is you're competing with each other. My idea will be better than your idea. And how many times do you and I both see that? How many times have we done it ourselves? We sit down at a circle table with everybody, and everybody wants to prove that they've got the latest word. They're the smartest person at the table.
I haven't personally ever done it, but I have observed it, Gordon.
Well, I did it one time in 1947. But dialogue is the humble communication. That's where I come saying, I do know something that I think other people will find worthy, but I can't wait to see how they develop this idea, because maybe we can mix and match those ideas. See, now we're pushing through the truth, the word. And that's something that I'm not sure I ever taught my churches to do. I'm embarrassed that I didn't see that earlier in life. We were just information peddlers. But to get people to sit in a circle, and that's why the number 12 is critical, because if you go beyond that, maybe 14, go beyond that, you begin to lose the opportunity for dialogue. We never let people sit outside a circle. Everybody's in the circle together. We never allowed spouses to sit with each other. In so doing, you create people that God can really begin to develop and see through. And so that's why, as time went by, the word dialogue became the key word of all the conversation that went on.
So what you've described sounds to me like a phenomenal experience. But how does it turn me into a disciple?
Well, let me roll back just a foot and say, you asked me what one does during the year. And I mentioned Myers-Briggs, and I mentioned learning how to read and discern. I mentioned the storytelling. All along the way, we're teaching people, first of all, what does spiritual character look like? What are the unique behaviors that we believe Christians are responsible to have? Then we went on and asked the question, what are the spiritual gifts that the Bible heralds? Is the Bible exhaustive in its list, or is it just giving you a sample list? I by the way, am more charmed by the second of those ideas, but other people might be different. So now we know character, we know spiritual gift. Then we start along in the middle of the year reading biographies of great leaders down through the centuries. Gail picks women's books for the women. There's some wonderful biographies out there, like Catherine Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. Women are always being told to read men's books. And when you start putting a woman's book in a woman's hands, some wonderful things can happen. So there comes that part of the year where every person becomes responsible to learn the biographical lifestyle of some great Christian over the last 2,000 years. So inevitably, someone will work on the story of St. Patrick, and somebody on St. Francis, John Wesley, some great Christian lay people, some of the women like Amy Carmichael, and it just goes on and on. And every week we give 45 minutes to someone reporting on a great leader down through the century, because we want people to know their history of leadership. Then in the summer, in the last part, we start talking about the call of God. How do you know what God's calling is? And there comes 2 nights at the end of the year that are some of the most precious times I've ever experienced in my life, where each person gets a chance to take their chair and sit in the center of the circle, and all the other 13 or 14, one by one, say, this is what I discern of the spiritual gifting that God has given you. I see this in you. I see that. So you'd hear people say, John, it seems to me that all during the year, every time the group wanted to accomplish something, you were the first person to suggest how we could get organized. It's very clear to me God has given you the natural gifts of a management leader. Don't ever do anything that takes you away from that. Mary, we've noticed that almost every time somebody came into the room each week and they were sad or they were hurting, you were the first person to discern what was going on and to call it to our attention so we could pray for that person. So you can imagine what it's like to sit in that circle with 13 or 14 of what has become your best friends. And one by one, they're going around the circle and telling you where they see God operating in your life. It is just incredibly moving.
Mm-hmm.
And people will say at the end of the year, no one's ever told me what God wants to do in my life like this. No one's ever told me that I had a potential for that or this. So when they leave on the 14th or the 40th Monday, the thing that they should be hearing at last is what Samuel heard from Eli. When the noise happens, listen to God because he has something to say to you. And we felt we were successful if we sent people out the last day thinking carefully about God's calling in their life. Wherever they went, obviously you wanted some of them to serve in the church, but they could go to work for a community agency and we were just as happy.
Mm-hmm.
We just knew that God had a call for them.
And interesting. And so after 40 weeks, it doesn't, based on the friendships you're forming, it doesn't sound like people are ready at the end of 40 weeks to say, okay, well, that was great. I'm glad it's over now. And I have my Monday night back.
No, everybody, you can bet on it. They start saying about 3 weeks before the end of the year, you know, Gordon, Gail, couldn't we just add a few more weeks on? We have so much more to talk about. Would you keep meeting with us till the 1st of September? We know you want another group, but you could give us 2 more months, couldn't you? You hear this over and over and over again. And Gail and I said, no, our contract was for 40 Monday nights. If you want to keep on meeting, that's fine. That's your business, but we're going to disappear. Now, one thing I left out way back, and it's very important. The rabbi contract always has a release point at the end. And we've talked about this, where Jesus finally says to the 12, no longer do I call you my servants or children, I call you my friends. In other words, you've gone from here to here.
Yeah.
Now you're on your own. And when you're on your own, you've got to start hearing God's Spirit. I'm putting the Spirit in you.
Mm.
So you see what the parallel is there. And we cut it at 40 weeks. And most of the groups went on and met on their own for a while until everybody had to start moving and everything. But we were out of there in 40 weeks. And that's what you could say about the disciples. They were out of there in about 2 years. And Jesus sent them on their way.
Now, you had a sense at the time that this was actually working and you were seeing and doing something that was transforming people. As you look back with the benefit of hindsight, would you still say, hey, this worked? And how do you assess that? How do you know it's working and how do you know it worked?
Well, I say, it works just by watching the people. You know what they were like when you first welcomed them 40 weeks ago into your house to be in the circle. You saw the awkwardness, the fear, the lack of confidence, the person who wanted to just, there's always the person who says, well, I just want to sit and listen. And we'd have to say, no, your commitment was when you came into this group, you would enter the dialogue. And, we know that there's a little bit of nervousness. We've all experienced it, but that's your commitment to the group. Nobody gets to stay outside the circle. So you're watching things like that all the way. You're watching how they, the confidence that's growing, how they talk about Jesus in their lives, what their aspirations turn out to be, so that when the year is over, you can pretty much discern who's going to go where and do what. I was standing in the balcony on Sunday of the church where we worship when Gail and I are not someplace doing something. And it was interesting, on the main floor of the church, there were 3 couples standing there. All of them had been members of one of these groups about 15, 18 years ago. And you could just see the joy in their conversation. I don't know what they were talking about, but just to see them together brought Gail and me a real sense of, God used us to start that.
Yeah. And you can see what they've gone on to do, because I know you told me you're still in touch with almost all of them.
Gail is, if we want to be really honest, Gail's the keeper and toucher.
Okay.
We're sending out 240 Christmas cards in this next few days. Guess who stamped most of them?
You just have to get her to learn your handwriting, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Gordon, what last word? What have we not talked about on this topic that you think is important?
We probably haven't made enough out of the fact that what you and I have been talking about probably takes 7 to 8 years to develop. And most of us don't have the patience for that. We want to say, boy, Gordon's got a great idea there. Let's see if we can pull people together in the month of March, and by June we'll have something. And that's just not the way it's going to work. It's a long range project. If we were doing it all over again, we would be starting a new group every September, about mid month, and graduating them out of it somewhere in the late month of June. But I don't think we recognize that building people takes time. We haven't tried to turn this into a program. People say all the time, I read your book, Going Deep, and why don't you give us a curriculum? And I'll say,
I'm one of them, right? I'm guilty.
Yeah, but we all want a program.
Yeah,
and I think one of the things that Gail and I were able to do, and we worked at this, is that we ourselves dialogued our way through each of these Monday evenings. We knew what we wanted to accomplish before the evening was over. We knew where we wanted to get, but we were not always. We didn't know everything that was going to happen when we started it in motion on Monday nights. There was a certain naturalness to it, and people loved it. The last Monday night of the year, we have an evaluation conversation. Tell us what you saw this year. What turned you on? What did you enjoy? And people would say, well, Gordon, I know you want us to talk about some of the books you made us read, and Gail, you wanted us to do this. But the most important thing we saw all year long as we came into your home was the way you kept it. The pictures on the wall, they're all family pictures. We watched Gail service, teach us how to serve, and then how she organized us to serve each other. And we watched the way the two of you would disagree with each other sometimes in the dialogue, and how Gail might challenge you, to see something differently, and how you would accept that challenge. And it was those kind of transactions that they would say they saw. And, Gail and I were not aware that we were putting on a show. This is just us. But people would say, we just love to come to this home. It speaks of peace. And we hope someday God will allow us to have a home like this. So there's all sorts of learning experiences happening on the formal level and the informal level. And people are imitating as time goes along. But at the end of the year, it's the Holy Spirit's problem as to what this has meant in the life of each of these people in terms of call.
Well, I do remember, just before we close out, I do remember some of the stories you tell in Going Deep. And so folks may want to pick that up. And the questions people would ask, and at the end, the things they would say, well, this is what I need to be praying about. And it was not junior varsity stuff. It was serious stuff that I would hazard to guess a lot of us who've been Christians for 30 plus years, that's not where I am. And so it was really accelerated the transformation in someone's life. And so it was great. Gordon, thank you so much for being with us again. Thank you for blessing. You're wonderful to be with, and I appreciate every minute we have together.
Well, that's an awfully kind thing for you to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for all of your ministry that you're still doing today. around New England. I'm grateful God put us in the same vineyard in which to labor.
And God bless Vision New England. You know, I've been around this organization since 1972. That's a long time.
It is, and we've been blessed by you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to part 2 of our conversation on intentional, practical disciple making with Gordon MacDonald. You can find his book on discipleship titled Going Deep on websites like Christian Bookstore or Amazon. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide. If you liked this, please like, share, and subscribe, or check out our website at visionnewengland.org, where you can learn more about us and partner in our work to accelerate evangelism and make disciples who do justice and share Jesus. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.